the realization that I've had kind of going back over the data and whatnot, besides the obvious, besides the fact that obviously in cities there were more freedoms for everybody, but for women specifically in terms of work and the control or lesser control that may be in the countryside. The reality is that mm, life in towns for medieval women was very much down to ambition and opportunity. And that sounds like a very beautiful story, but of course, it has some very, very, very complicated things that we need to digest. Now, one aspect that, of course, I didn't treat much last week, and I didn't really have quite enough space to treat this week, is the position of women in the church in cities. We know that some of the most, let's say, prosperous communities of, let's say, abbeys, convents, etc., run by women were often associated either with royal foundations or with towns. Why? Because the outlet that those women had for production of goods that kept them alive and that obviously could give them a leg up in society was simply higher due to the access of those markets and whatnot. Pretty much in the vast majority of what will remain as the Catholic countries of Europe, we still have in most cities countless cities that at least were founded in the Middle Ages, I mean, countless of convents by the Clarissas, by the Carmelites, by foundations of specifically women and women in solitude that have withstand the march of time in that regards, and that to some extent we have to consider this as single women because nuns were, well, married to God, but in reality married to none. And on that front, we do notice that it is actually within this context where we start seeing some really important women growing into their own roles in that specific setting, not just for the women in the convents, but for a lot of the women who were the patrons of said convents, said abbeys, etc., which often were women in those cities and often many widows, which by definition, unless they got remarried, were also, I guess, considered, I'll say it, um, single women in that regards. Now, the other thing that I didn't mention all that much last week, and it's mostly because we still don't have full understanding of what it all entailed, was the communities of Beguines, which are particularly, popular in certain areas of Western Europe, mostly in the north of France and in the lower countries. In case you're not familiar with the Beguines, these were Christian lay religious orders. They didn't exactly live monastic lives like, say, nuns and monks in this particular case. But we do know that these Bedouin communities really were a sincere opportunity for women who lived alone to kind of make a community for themselves without necessarily having to take vows. And actually, in some places in what used to be the Low Countries and in some places in France, there are still neighborhoods in those cities that are marked by these Bedouin communities. So by no means a completely widespread movement, but imagine this, communities of single women who were not necessarily nuns, although perhaps secluded from the rest of the world, and that actually lived, although independently and singly, in community and cohabitation with other women for the benefit of everyone. I think I would happily say that this is probably the happiest or one of the happiest successes that we have for single women in urban medieval Europe from that perspective. In case that you're interested in some places where these, I'll say it, neighborhoods and communities still remain, obviously not in that shape anymore because the idea of the Beguines kind of disappeared in the 16th, 17th century. But Liège is a city where the movement sort of started and where some of the neighborhoods are still there. Cambrai and Valenciennes, if I remember correctly as well, three of the most important. But of course, on the flip side of that, we have the situation of single women living in extreme poverty, single women being essentially taken to brothels, technically under their own volition, but as we know, essentially forcefully so by members of their family to care for themselves or to be able to find a source of income. It is a very disparate and very harsh reality in that regards, where we can see a potential for a lot of good, but also a potential for a lot of bad. The one thing that it is very important, to understand one way or another, is that all of this came with a certain degree of sacrifice. In order to achieve that independence, they needed to bargain with something. Either they needed to bargain with their relationship to the outside world, they needed to bargain with the terms and conditions of their employment, they needed to bargain with what positions they could acquire in life and which ones they couldn't. And that's not to say this is not a pattern that is replicated in rural communities, but to some extent, peasanthood is pretty straightforward. You are a peasant, you wake up in the morning, you go to the field, you do your duties to your family and to your community, you go to bed, repeat the next day. Which, although it may not sound terribly glamorous, it is straightforward. There is nothing to figure out. The foundations, your pathway, etc., is laid out right in front of you. But the audacity, tenacity, and quite serious amounts of complications that these women must have encountered while actually trying to find their voices within urban spaces and protect that independence must have been pretty tough because of, what they must give up for said independence is not always easy or good, right? So, like I said, it is a really bittersweet story and one that I really do not want to, make into a glamorous type of situation. The other thing that we also need to consider is that from society to society, the results could be completely different. Um, as Christianization really seeps in the vast majority of Europe, the role of women is a lot more, let's say, centralized and very clearly determined by gender conducts. Yet, for example, you go to the Arabic cities of Europe at that moment in time, some places in Italy, mostly Spain, and the areas of the Balkans, and you see women who had the power of achieving certain things in life, women in urban Europe, from a medieval perspective, that was Christian, might never have been able to. Although this is an example from Morocco, one of the oldest universities in the world was actually established in Fez by a woman, by Fatima. And this is during the medieval period, 11th to 12th century. A lot of people contest the story, but we have evidence that she existed, and we have evidence that the money was in her care and dedicated to learning opportunities. And sure, you can read into it whatever you want, but we see similar evidence in the Caliphate of Cordoba all the way up to the Taifa kingdoms of Spain, the Almohads and the Almoravids, showcasing that a lot of these women, normally women of higher elite, but even in lower, scales of society, had different opportunities in those Muslim environments in cities than they would have anywhere else in Europe. Similarly to what we were discussing to some extent as well with some of the Jewish women in the communities. But then again, there is all the stigma that came from the, I guess, identity alienation. The identity of medieval communities in cities is already complicated enough. The more layers you add to it, the more difficult it is to digest and to fully understand. So, to that we need to add the layer of urbanite, of status, of gender, and then not even just gender, but the less favorable gender making choices that are even less favorable for themselves from a legal or economic point of view. It's difficult to really get the full grasp of it, because on top of that, the vast majority of the time, the people recording these stories were not paying attention to these women. So to some extent, we also need to apply a certain degree of speculation, which at the end of the day is nothing but speculation, of course. Does that make some sense?
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
good.
thank you.
Yes.
I kind of I kind of started linking one thing with another, which I was like, oh yeah, I should have added that last week, but well, I simply, I could have added a million things last week and the previous week and the other one, but we only have as much time as we do, of course. But it is definitely a field, the lives of women in urban spaces during the Middle Ages and in general in urban spaces throughout history that is starting to get more attention. The problem is, accessing sources that are truly reliable and sometimes having to look, let's say, in between the lines, often in records, administration, and whatnot. Well, on that note, anything else?